This library will belong to the people of the United States. My papers will be the property of the people and be accessible to them. And this is as it should be. The papers of the president are among the most valuable sources of material for history. They ought to be preserved, and they ought to be used. And the library is used in continually increasing numbers by the American people. All the people whose President Harry Truman was proud to be. And by accredited researchers, both students and historians. Mr. Truman once said, "There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know." And he added, "But it's not enough to know history without doing something about the future." This sense of history, as a perpetually vitalizing force, is the animating spirit of the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. In a room such as this, and it has been called the loneliest room in the world, as a fit description of any president's office, the destinies of peoples and nations wait on one man's judgments. Events around the world, anywhere on the great globe itself, react to the impact of a president's policies, an impact felt on the day of decision and on all the tomorrows after. Yet the Truman Library is a vital tribute not merely to one administration, but to the institution of the presidency itself. The actions of the men who occupy the presidential chair turn on a pivot of time that intimately affects what happens to us all. The fate of one such man can seem the fate of an entire nation. On April 12th, 1945, less than 2 hours after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the leaders of a bereaved country were summoned to the White House. There in the cabinet room, Harry S. Truman was sworn into office as the 32nd American to assume the presidency of these United States. The shock of a nation that had lost its leader after 12 tumultuous years was reflected in the sense of terrible responsibility experienced by Harry Truman as he took up his duties. "I felt," he said, "like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." It was an apt expression of his and the country's predicament. For, though waning, a cold warrior's moon still rode over a ravaged world. The stars of peace continue to be obscured by the smoke of battle. The destiny of at least one planet remained uncertain. Pressure, the nation's new president was reacting decisively to the pressure of time.
And defend those ideals with all my strength and all my heart.
Addressing a joint session of Congress, he pledged himself to carry out the war and peace policies of Franklin Roosevelt. He asked for public support of a strong and lasting United Nations, and he reaffirmed the Allied demands for unconditional surrender of the Axis powers.
Until no vestige of resistance remains. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
One of the means to achieve that military aim, the world's first atomic weapon, was under top-secret development. The president explored in depth its awesome potentialities at a conference with Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson and Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. Even had the bomb been available at that time, and it was not, events in the European theater of war precluded its use there. On April 25th, the United States and Soviet link-up took place at the River Elbe. The German Reich was split in two. On April 29th, the career of dictator Benito Mussolini came to a violent end at the hands of an angry Italian populace. It was on that same day that the last Nazi forces in the country surrendered. May 1st, the official German radio announced the death of Adolf Hitler. Exactly 1 week later, on May 8th, General Jodl unconditionally surrendered the last of the German forces. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted less than 13 years. With lifted heart, Harry S. Truman journeyed to San Francisco to participate in the ceremonies attending the signing of the United Nations Charter. It was President Truman's privilege to witness the fulfillment of President Roosevelt's dream. But as yet, only half a war had been won, and not even half a peace. At Potsdam, in that sector of defeated Germany occupied by Soviet Russia, the Allies met to consider not only the fate of a conquered nation, but the reconstruction of the countries that nation had ravaged. It was to be the last meeting of the Allies as mutually trusting comrades in arms. At that meeting, Harry S. Truman, the man from Independence, had an ace in the hole. A crater blasted in the white sands of New Mexico by a detonative force more powerful than any yet devised by the triggering mind of man. But awesome as the New Mexico test had proved, two, and only two, of the new weapons were available. How how and when and where to use those bombs was one man's decision. And 1 million individual lives, the human cost to both nations of a seaborne invasion of the Japanese mainland, hung in the balance. When the imperial government of Japan rejected the Potsdam ultimatum to surrender, President Truman acted. Even the terrible argument of the Hiroshima blast did not persuade the Japanese war leaders. A single bomb remained in America's atomic arsenal. On August 9th, the second bomb was detonated over Nagasaki. On September 1st, 1945, President Truman was able to tell his fellow Americans that not only their thoughts and hopes, but indeed the thoughts and hopes of all the civilized world were centered on the battleship Missouri. There, he announced, on that small piece of American soil anchored in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese had officially laid down their arms and signed terms of unconditional surrender. In the first 4 months of Harry Truman's presidency, more than a war had ended. The Japanese surrender document closed a final door on a period of history. Henceforth, new constellations of energies, cultures, and powers were to create new patterns of being for people everywhere. Many primary sources from which that world was constructed are to be found in the Truman Library archives. Raw materials from which historians can derive a balanced understanding of contemporary man's actions and meanings. The presidential papers of Mr. Truman are the heart of the collection. But the ultimate aim of the library is to represent not just one president, but the continuous, influential functioning of the office of the presidency itself. As part of the National Archives and Records Service, which is administered by the General Services Administration of the United States government, the Truman Library is able to gather together sources of history as varied and vivid as the men and times with which they deal. Much of the research at the library is made possible through grants in aid awarded to scholars by a non-governmental organization, the Truman Library Institute. In a modern research center such as the Truman Library, the impress of the past is made available to the present through the records of history. These records, like the human events they chronicle, assume many forms. From such sources, scholars seek to derive the fundamental meanings underlying the flow of events we call history. Their aim is to discover beneath surface disorder the deep formative designs that are continuously, relentlessly shaping patterns of the world in which each of us must lead our lives. In a quiet room like this, a bridge has been built between the rustle of documents and the jackhammer impact of a technological civilization. Because history is a continuing process, decisions and proposals of earlier periods build toward measures that vitally affect individual lives years afterwards. Health programs initiated during the Truman administration were the first steps toward the Johnson Medicare bill that came 2 decades later. Such long concern for the American people was typical of Harry Truman. It lay at the base of his desire to be their president, a president for all the people, as he put it. But in 1948, the question arose, how did the people themselves feel about Harry? The omens were bad. Not only were most pollsters and publishers dubious of the Truman chances, his own party was split with the kind of glorious disunity for which it had so often been noted. With dissent to the right of him, dissent to the left of him, Harry Truman, seemingly almost alone in the middle, stood like a boy upon a burning political deck. Harry Truman went to the people, galloping across the country on that most traditional form of American transportation, the iron horse. Wherever the campaign train chugged to a brief stop, Wenatchee, Washington, or Wewoka, Oklahoma, Harry Truman stepped out onto the old-fashioned observation platform and into the hearts of the public. On November 2nd, the campaigns closed. The polls opened. The candidates cast their predictable ballots. The unpredictable American public was still to be heard from. An influential newspaper brought in its verdict somewhat early on election night. Only one thing had the pundits overlooked: that final and decisive poll, the ballot box. Harry Truman, who had begun his campaign as apparently a minority of one, had finally emerged as the choice of the national electorate. On this Bible, Harry S. Truman took the oath of office for his first time as the elected leader of the United States. It was an event of more than national significance. American power had become world power. Both before and after the '48 election, Truman's policies shaped global events as decisively as they did domestic ones. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine, ensuring the independence of Greece and Turkey, drew a line preventing further Soviet expansion in Europe.
Of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
That same year, President Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall formulated the Marshall Plan to aid in the rebuilding of Western Europe. When communist aggression threatened West Berlin in 1948, a massive airlift preserved the freedom of a former foe. In 1949, the United States and Europe joined the North Atlantic powers in a military coalition. The NATO treaty was signed by the President's new Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. But on June 24th, 1950, the threat of major war thundered on the Asian horizon. North Korean armed forces invaded the Republic of South Korea. President Truman's response was immediate. An appeal to the United Nations Security Council resulted in a resolution calling on all members to give assistance to South Korea. The President named General Douglas MacArthur to head a unified military command. The United Nations police action began its successful push to the north. Driving the invading forces out of South Korea, UN forces captured the North Korean capital and pressed on to the Manchurian border. But then what the President had feared, what General MacArthur had declared unlikely, occurred. As Red Chinese forces swarmed into Korea, what had seemed a United Nations triumph suddenly turned into what was very nearly a disastrous defeat. The catastrophe of World War III, which America and her United Nations allies had sought to avoid, seemed imminent unless the Korean conflict could be contained. Contrary to established military policy, MacArthur publicly and repeatedly disagreed with the concept of a limited war and pushed for an attack on China itself. This open opposition clearly seemed insubordinate to the President as Commander-in-Chief. He acted.
A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
The single largest collection of public opinion mail in the archives of the Truman Library is this record of reaction to the MacArthur recall. At first, predominantly vituperative and outraged, soon the tenor of the messages began to change. But whether he was abused or praised, the President remained unperturbed. He told a friend, "Even the chiefs of staff came to the conclusion that civilian control of the military was at stake, and I didn't let it stay at stake very long." It is a significant statement from a significant man in a significant time. During the Truman years, years that continue to shape our destinies, great issues were at stake, and Harry S. Truman was the kind of president who didn't let them stay at stake very long. The library is vibrantly alive with the implications of those germinal years, as the scope of its collection testifies. It encompasses not only the trials and triumphs of an era, but its treasures. It is the great value of such a center as the Truman Library that it becomes essentially a storehouse of the imagination, by making available to us the varying, sometimes incongruous materials of history from which our lives are built. Yet beneath all the diversity of the Truman Library lies one unifying concept. The same concept that shaped Harry S. Truman's life and political philosophy. The firm conviction that the highest aim of any democracy is to be truly a government for all the people.